Hey, what's up guys? Welcome to the channel. The UFC recently announced UFC 277, a pay-per-view on July 30th, and the main event is Julianna Peña versus Amanda Nunes 2 for the women's bantamweight title. And they announced not only the main event, but the entire main card. And I've seen a lot of people complaining online about this card and about this main event in general. So I wanted to make a video. Is Julianna Peña versus Amanda Nunes 2 main event worthy, and also kind of touch on the card as a whole, because I believe a lot of people are just looking at this main event and crapping on UFC 277. And I am in particular, and this is going to sound shocking to some of you guys, I am more excited for UFC 277, Julianna Peña versus Amanda Nunes 2, than I have been for some Conor McGregor cards. Yes, I said that. I'm going to get to that in a minute. I'm going to kind of talk about those cards and I'm in particular that I'm talking about. But guys, do me a favor, if you enjoy these videos, make sure to like the video. And if you're not subscribed, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. So first off, you look at the main event, and my first reaction to this main event, actually, let me go back a little bit. They initially announced Julianna Peña and Amanda Nunes as the Ultimate Fighters coaches. And I thought this was a terrible idea, but myself, I don't watch The Ultimate Fighter. I haven't watched The Ultimate Fighter in years, so I really didn't care all that much. The only reason I dislike The Ultimate Fighter in general is because usually it delays fights for longer than they should be. I remember years ago, they did Anthony Pettis versus Gilbert Melendez on The Ultimate Fighter, and it held up the lightweight division for like 8 months when both guys were healthy. So that's one reason I hate The Ultimate Fighter. But outside of that, I wasn't going to watch anyway unless they put some crazy good coaches on there. I wasn't going to watch anyway, so it didn't bother me too much. And when I heard this was going to be the main event of a pay-per-view, even myself was a little bit annoyed. I'm like, oh, this is going to be the main event of a pay-per-view. And I know a lot of people lately have been crapping on women's MMA, myself included as well. I've talked about it. Okay, it's not the greatest, especially, you look at the women's 135-pound division, it leaves a lot to be desired. The women's 145-pound division is non-existent. The 125 is still kind of evolving. 115 is really, really solid though. But, I was like, this is the main event. They couldn't do better than this, and I was wondering what the card would look like. But then as I really started to think about it, if any women's fight belongs in the main event, Julianna Peña versus Amanda Nunes 2 belongs in a main event. You have Amanda Nunes, who most people consider the women's GOAT, who lost her title in a massive upset, where a lot of people think, maybe she underestimated Julianna Peña. There's a massive storyline here, and she's getting the rematch. Now it's been, 6 months or so since that fight. And now she's getting the rematch, and she's going back to try to claim her gold. And the biggest fights in UFC history have been rematches. I'll never forget Anderson Silva, Chris Weidman too. That was, I think, the biggest fight at the time. They actually raised the price of a pay-per-view temporarily at the time just because that fight was so big. And I think this is a very compelling fight because Amanda Nunes just a few months ago was considered the women's female GOAT. And now she's lost her title. And if she goes back in this rematch and loses again, where does she go from there? Is it retirement? What happens there? And then these are two very good women's bantamweight fighters. And I get the women's bantamweight division isn't that great. And I get the first fight was kind of garbage in my opinion. It was exciting, don't get me wrong. But as far as it from a technical fighting aspect, it was a lot of just staring at the ground, and just throwing punches wildly, which was exciting. But it just wasn't, it didn't look like elite level striking. And then you had Amanda Nunes' gas tank kind of failure. Julianna Peña, super gritty, locks in the rear naked choke, didn't really have any control. And Amanda Nunes taps really quick. And I get people crapping on that fight. While it was exciting, it didn't appear to be high level MMA. But this is going to be very interesting because Amanda Nunes, that's the first time she's really looked like that. And I suspect that she vastly underestimated Julianna Peña. And I think she's going to come back in this fight. I think she's taking Julianna Peña serious now. I think she's doing a legitimate training camp for this fight. And I'm curious to see if she can get her belt back. I think that's a massive storyline. Forget about whatever happens on The Ultimate Fighter. We have the women's female GOAT trying to get her title back. And then also, they did a very solid card underneath of it. I have no problem with these main events that are a little bit, they're not these massive title fights, that people are really highly anticipating, like at UFC 274, Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, amazing fight. They had a solid card underneath of it, but when they have these fights that aren't as big as that, or a Charles Oliveira, Islam Makhachev, or Kamaru Usman, Jorge Masvidal 1, something like that, and they build the card solid underneath of it, I have no problem with these types of pay-per-view main events. And you look at the card as a whole, the co-main event, Brandon Moreno versus Kai Kara France 2 for the interim flyweight belt. Forget about the interim belt. That's an amazing matchup. You have Derek Lewis versus Sergey Pavlovich. That is a great heavyweight fight. You have Luke Rockhold versus Paulo Costa. There's some rumors that might be moving to August. That is an amazing middleweight fight and has implications within the middleweight title picture. Magomed Ankalaev versus Anthony Smith. Another great fight on the main card. This is a solid pay-per-view main card, and I have no problem when the main event isn't just crazy hype, hyped up, and we still have an amazing main card. I have no problem paying the money for this main event. And the reason I say that is because there's been worse events. You go back, you look at UFC 246. This is where Conor McGregor comes in. Conor McGregor versus Donald Cerrone. First off, I was not excited for this fight at all. I knew it wasn't going to be competitive. I knew Conor McGregor was going to destroy him. Donald Cerrone was on a losing streak at the time. Conor McGregor had been out for a little bit, but I knew Conor McGregor was going to come back and destroy Cowboy Cerrone. So that was the biggest drawing factor, was Conor McGregor's return. It wasn't going to be a competitive fight, and he did go out there and destroy it. But let's look at the rest of the card. The co-main event was Holly Holm versus Raquel Pennington. Garbage. Alexei Oleinik versus Maurice Green. I mean, garbage. I don't even think Maurice Green is with the UFC anymore. And that's the featured fight on a pay-per-view main card. Come on now. I'm not even going to go through the rest of it. UFC 257. This was a little bit better. You had Dustin Poirier versus Conor McGregor. And then that was the original rematch, not the trilogy. That was a great fight. Don't get me wrong. It was a compelling matchup. The whole storyline of, they had fought years ago, and now Dustin's trying to come back and get revenge, which he did by knocking Conor out. But you look at the rest of the card. The co-main event, Dan Hooker, Michael Chandler's debut from coming over from Bellator. Great fight. You look at the rest of the card, it leaves a lot to be desired. The featured fight on the main card was Jessica Ai versus Joanne Wood. Come on now. Then Andrew Sanchez versus Mahmoud Muradov. That's an okay fight, but main card of a pay-per-view? Come on now. Then we go, the very next event, garbage, UFC 258. The main event, Kamaru Usman versus Gilbert Burns. Very, very compelling fight. The co-main event was Macy Barber versus Alexa Grasso. This was a terrible main card pay-per-view. And then one last example. This is the one that's a little bit iffy because this was still a good card. Derek Lewis versus Cyril Gane for the interim heavyweight title. This was August of last year. This was a solid card. They built a little bit underneath of this. You had Song Yudong versus Casey Kenny, Tisha Torres versus Angela Hill, Chiesa versus Luque, Jose Aldo versus Pedro Munoz. But still, this wasn't, I think in general, UFC 277 is way better than this card. And then the most recent example, which I forgot I even had here, I believe that Julianna Peña versus Amanda Nunes 2, I believe is a better main event, okay? And I'm probably going to get killed for this in the comments, but I want you to let me know your opinion on this in the comments. Is a better main event than UFC 272, which the main event was Colby Covington versus Jorge Masvidal, a grudge match. This fight was irrelevant to the division. They had one win between them since 2019 and 4 losses to Kamaru Usman. And the only reason this fight was put together was because it was a grudge match. Neither guy was going to fight for a title after this fight. It was a style matchup where if Jorge Masvidal didn't get the early KO, he was going to get out grappled. He was going to fade and get out grappled, which is eventually what happened. And then you look at the rest of the card. It's okay, but Rafael Dos Anjos versus Renato Moicano, and that wasn't even supposed to be on there. Dos Anjos was supposed to fight Rafael Fiziev a couple weeks before. Fiziev got sick. It got moved to 272, and then Fiziev pulled out like a couple days before or something like that. You had Barboza versus Bryce Mitchell, which is decent. Kevin Holland versus Alex Oliveira. But come on now. This is not a great card, and this is not a great main event. I would have preferred, them to stack UFC 272. I would have been okay with the Covington versus Masvidal main event if the undercard was stacked equal to how stacked UFC 277 is. So I get it. It's not the biggest fight in the world. It's not the most compelling fight in the world, but it is a very compelling fight with an interesting backstory. And again, the main card is amazing. Moreno versus Kai Kara France 2 interim flyweight title. Derek Lewis versus Sergey Pavlovich. You have Magomed Ankalaev versus Anthony Smith. Paulo Costa versus Luke Rockhold. You even have Drakkar Klose versus Diego Ferreira on the card. This is a very solid card, and I have no problem with UFC 277. I have no problem paying with this card. I'm not going to complain about this card. I think this is a solid UFC pay-per-view, and I think I have no problem with this being in the main event, considering how the card underneath of it looks. I'm actually kind of excited to see Ken Nunes get her belt back. I'm super excited for this card in general. There's so many great fights on the card. Comment down below and let me know what you guys think about all this. What's your favorite fight on UFC 277? I'm genuinely curious. Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.